Rick Hayes pushed open the airlock of his cargo ship with his shoulder, nearly dropping the bag of cheap noodles and cheaper whiskey he'd picked up from the station market. 3 days of drinking at Murphy's Bar had left him broke, hungover, and behind on repairs. Again. The Iron Mule wasn't much to look at, a beaten-up freighter held together by duct tape and prayer, but she was his. Had been for 7 years now, ever since he'd won her in a card game from a Centauri smuggler who didn't know when to fold. He tossed the supplies onto the galley counter and grabbed his toolkit. The coolant leak wasn't going to fix itself, and if he didn't patch it soon, the entire port engine would overheat during the next jump. Rick had learned mechanics the hard way, working in his uncle's garage back on Earth, fixing ancient combustion engines that most people had forgotten existed. Turned out those same principles worked pretty well on spacecraft, much to the annoyance of all those fancy engineers with their expensive degrees. The exterior hull was quiet except for the hiss of the station's recycled air and the distant clang of other ships docking and departing. Rick clipped his safety line to the hull and started working his way down to the undercarriage where the leak was. He was humming an old rock song, off-key as usual, when his hand touched something that definitely wasn't supposed to be there. It was warm. Alive. Rick jerked back, his heart hammering. He pulled out his work light and shined it into the shadows beneath his ship. At first, his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. It was too big, too impossible. Scales caught the light, shimmering with colors that seemed to shift and change, blues bleeding into purples bleeding into shades that didn't have names. A massive body, easily the size of a shuttle, was pressed against the hull. Wings were folded tight against its sides, bound by chains that glowed with a sickly green light. A dragon. There was a damn dragon chained to his ship. Rick had seen a lot of weird things in his years running cargo on the Outer Rim. He'd met aliens with 4 heads, watched gas clouds that could think, even delivered supplies to a colony of sentient plants. But dragons were myths, stories people told in bars after too many drinks. They weren't real. They couldn't be real. The creature's eye opened. It was huge, easily the size of Rick's head, with a pupil that looked like a slash of pure darkness. The eye fixed on him, and Rick felt something he'd never experienced before. It was like someone had reached into his skull and was rummaging around in his brain, not painfully, but definitely there. Then he heard the voice. It wasn't sound, not really. It came from inside his head, deep and ancient, carrying weight that made his teeth ache. Human, it said. Finally. I was beginning to think you'd never return to your vessel. Rick opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. I'm having a stroke, he said finally. That's what this is. Too much cheap whiskey. You are not having a stroke, the voice replied, and despite everything, there was amusement in it. I am Vorath, last of the free anchors. And you, mechanic, are in considerable danger. Rick looked at the chains binding the creature. Up close, he could see they weren't just metal. They pulsed like living things, and where they touched the dragon's scales, the colors dimmed and faded. Those look like they hurt. They do more than hurt. They feed on my essence, converting my life force into a tracking signal. The collectors bound me here 2 cycles ago, using your ship as bait. Bait for what? For you. For your kind. They want to find the hidden human colonies, the salvage operations, the places your species doesn't report to the Galactic Council. Your people have a reputation for finding valuable things in forgotten places. The collectors want those locations. Rick processed this, his mechanic's brain already examining the chains, looking for weak points, connection nodes, anything he could work with. So they figured I'd just fly around, and you'd send them a nice map of everywhere I went. Precisely. And if you attempted to free me using conventional methods, the chains would detonate. The explosion would vaporize your ship, this section of the station, and myself. Very tidy. Rick pulled himself closer, studying the chains. They were made of something he'd never seen before, crystal and metal fused together in patterns that hurt to look at too long. There was an energy signature coming off them that made his tools rattle in their belt. This was technology way beyond anything the Council species had, beyond anything he'd ever worked on. Why tell me all this? Rick asked. Why not just wait for me to fly somewhere important and let your buddies grab the intel? The dragon's massive head shifted slightly, as much as the chains would allow. Because the collectors are not my allies. They are slavers, collectors of rare beings and unique resources. I am imprisoned. And I am offering you a bargain. Rick waited. Free me, Vorath said, and I will give you something no human has ever possessed. I will teach you to see the currents of space itself, to understand dimensional engineering as my kind does. You could revolutionize your species' technology. You could become the greatest engineer humanity has ever known. It was tempting. Real tempting. Rick thought about his uncle's garage, about all the times fancy engineers had looked down on him for learning by doing instead of studying. He thought about the Iron Mule, always one repair away from falling apart. But he also thought about the families in those hidden colonies, the kids growing up in places where the Council's laws and the Collector's greed couldn't reach them. He thought about his sister Beth, living on one of those settlements with her 2 boys. "That's a hell of an offer," Rick said slowly. "But even if I wanted to help, I don't have the first clue how to crack these chains without blowing us both to atoms." "You have something most species lack," Vorith replied. "Humans see patterns where others see chaos. You improvise. You make impossible solutions work through sheer stubbornness. I have been studying your kind since the Collectors chained me here. You are infuriating, reckless, and somehow brilliant." Rick snorted. "You been talking to my ex-wife?" Despite everything, despite the danger and the impossibility of the situation, Rick felt something shift inside him. He'd spent his whole life fixing things everyone said couldn't be fixed, making dead engines roar back to life, keeping ships flying when they should have been scrapped years ago. This was just another broken thing that needed fixing. Just happened to be a dragon this time. "All right," Rick said, pulling out his scanner and starting to map the energy flows in the chains. "Let's see what we're working with here. But if this kills me, I'm gonna be really annoyed." Vorith's laughter rumbled through his mind, and despite himself, Rick grinned. This was either the stupidest decision he'd ever made, or the start of something incredible. Probably both. Rick had been working on the chains for 3 hours straight, his fingers cramping, sweat dripping into his eyes despite the cold of space. Vorith had been feeding him information, explaining energy patterns and dimensional frequencies in ways that somehow made sense to his grease-stained mechanic's brain. It was like learning a new language, except this language could bend the laws of physics. He just figured out that the chains operated on a feedback loop, constantly adjusting their energy output based on Vorith's life signs, when his ship's proximity alarm started screaming. Rick's blood went cold. He knew that sound. Something big had just dropped out of hyperspace way too close to the station. "We have company," Vorith said calmly, though Rick could feel tension radiating from the dragon's mind. Rick scrambled back inside the Iron Mule, his boots clanging on the metal deck as he rushed to the cockpit. The view screen showed exactly what he'd feared. A collector battle cruiser hung in space like a dark knife, easily 10 times the size of his freighter. Its hull was covered in salvage tech from a dozen different species, all bolted together in a way that should have looked ridiculous but instead looked terrifying. The comm channel crackled to life. The voice that came through was cold, mechanical, translated by some AI that stripped away any emotion. "Human vessel Iron Mule. You are harboring stolen collector property. Surrender the dimensional entity immediately, or your ship will be seized and your life forfeited." Rick's hands hovered over the controls. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to jump to hyperspace and deal with the problem later. But Vorith was still chained to his hull. If he jumped now, the dimensional stress might trigger the chain's detonation sequence. And even if it didn't, he'd just be leading the collectors straight to whatever destination he picked. "What do I do?" Rick muttered, more to himself than Vorith. "Most species would surrender," Vorith replied in his head. "Or attempt to flee and be destroyed. But you're human. You do neither." "Yeah, well, being human doesn't make me bulletproof. That thing has enough firepower to turn me into space dust." "True. But you have something they don't expect. You have me, and 3 hours of jury-rigged modifications to my prison." Rick looked at his scanner readings. The work he'd been doing, trying to understand the chain's energy patterns, had created some weird feedback in the system. Power was flowing both ways now, from the chains into Vorith and back again. It was unstable, dangerous, and absolutely not what he'd been trying to accomplish. An idea hit him. A stupid, reckless, absolutely insane idea. "Vorith, if I reroute power through those chains, could we use them as a weapon?" There was a pause. "The energy required would be immense. It would drain your ship's reactor completely. You would have one shot, perhaps two, before your systems failed." "That's one more shot than I have now." Rick's fingers flew over the controls, bypassing safety systems his uncle would have smacked him for touching. He rerouted the main reactor, the backup cells, even the life support reserves into a jury-rigged conduit he'd built from spare parts and desperation. The ship groaned around him, bulkheads creaking from the strain. The collector cruiser was charging weapons. Rick could see the energy building in their forward cannons, enough power to crack a moon. "Here goes everything," Rick whispered, and slammed his hand down on the firing control. The iron mule shuddered like it had been punched by a giant. Every light in the ship flickered and died, plunging Rick into darkness. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the view screen, running on emergency power, showed something beautiful and terrifying. A beam of pure dimensional energy, colors that shouldn't exist twisted together, had punched straight through the collector cruiser's shields like they were tissue paper. The beam carved through 3 decks before Rick's reactor finally gave out and the weapon died. The collector ship hung there, smoke and atmosphere venting from the massive hole in its side. Their weapons powered down. They weren't destroyed, not completely, but they were definitely hurting. Rick's comm crackled again. This time, the mechanical voice carried something new. Confusion. Maybe even fear. Impossible. Human civilian vessels do not possess dimensional weaponry. Your technology level does not permit such devices. Rick found his voice, trying to keep it steady despite his hands shaking. "Yeah, well, we're full of surprises. Now back off, or the next shot goes through your bridge." It was a complete bluff. His reactor was dead, and it would take hours to bring it back online. He had about as much chance of firing again as he did of sprouting wings and flying. But the collectors didn't know that. The cruiser's engines flared to life. Slowly, keeping its damaged side away from Rick's ship, it began to back away. Within minutes, it had retreated to a safe distance. Then, with a flash of distorted light, it jumped to hyperspace and was gone. Rick sat in his pilot's chair in the darkness, listening to his heart hammer against his ribs. His ship was dead in the water. Emergency life support would last maybe 6 hours. He just picked a fight with one of the most powerful organizations in the galaxy using a weapon he'd built from spare parts and dragon chains. That was magnificently stupid, Vorath said in his mind, and Rick could hear the approval in the ancient voice. "Stupid is kind of our thing," Rick replied, already pulling up the damage reports on his backup tablet. The reactor was fried, the power conduits were melted, and half his systems were showing critical errors. But they were alive. "They will return," Vorath warned. "And next time, they will bring more ships. Ships prepared for dimensional weapons." Rick nodded, even though the dragon couldn't see him in the dark. "Then we need to get these chains off you before they do. And I'm gonna need help. Real help, from people who know what they're doing." "You have someone in mind?" Rick thought about New Prometheus Station, 3 days away at normal speed if he could get his engines running. It was a frontier outpost, the kind of place where the Galactic Council's rules were more like suggestions. Engineers, scientists, and various brilliant lunatics gathered there, working on projects that ranged from genius to criminally insane. If anyone could help him free a dragon using impossible technology, it would be someone from New Prometheus. "Yeah," Rick said, pulling himself out of the chair and heading down to the engine room with a flashlight. "I know a place. Just gotta get this rust bucket moving first." As he worked in the darkness, rerouting power and bypassing damaged systems, Rick felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. He'd spent so long just surviving, running cargo and staying one step ahead of debt collectors. Now he was part of something bigger, something that mattered. Sure, he'd probably die horribly. The collectors would come back with a fleet, and his luck would eventually run out. But right now, in this moment, he'd done something impossible. He'd stared down a warship with nothing but spare parts and stubbornness. That was pretty damn human. 4 hours later, the Iron Mule's engines coughed back to life. They sounded terrible, grinding and wheezing like an old man with pneumonia, but they worked. Rick plotted a course for New Prometheus, engaged the autopilot, and collapsed into his bunk. Tomorrow, he'd figure out how to save a dragon and maybe change the galaxy. Tonight, he'd settle for not dying in his sleep. As consciousness faded, he heard Vorath's voice one more time. "Your species is either the bravest in the galaxy or the most foolish. I have not yet decided which." Rick smiled in the darkness. Can't it be both? New Prometheus Station looked like someone had built a city inside an asteroid and then forgotten to clean it up for 20 years. Docking bays jutted out at odd angles, neon signs flickered in 3 different languages, and the whole place hummed with the sound of 1,000 different projects all happening at once. It was exactly the kind of chaos Rick needed. He'd sent messages ahead to 3 people he trusted, or at least trusted more than random strangers. Getting the Iron Mule to the station had taken every trick he knew, and the ship was now held together by hope and emergency patches. Vorath remained hidden beneath the hull, the chains still pulsing with that sickly green light, still draining the dragon's strength bit by bit. Rick met his team in Bay 12, the most private spot he could rent on short notice. The first to arrive was Beth Parker, a physicist who'd been kicked out of the Galactic Science Academy 5 years ago for publishing papers about dimensional bridging that everyone said were impossible. She was short, wore glasses held together with tape, and had the intense look of someone who'd forgotten to sleep for 3 days straight. "You said you had something that would make my theories look sane," Beth said by way of greeting. "This better be good, Rick. I turned down a paying job to come here." "It's good," Rick promised. "It's real good. Or real bad. Haven't decided yet." Tom Russell showed up next, a big guy with arms like tree trunks and a military buzz cut that he kept even though he'd been out of the service for a decade. He'd been a combat engineer, the kind of guy who could build a bridge under fire or blow one up with equal skill. These days he made his living modifying ships and weapons for people who didn't ask too many questions. "Rick?" Tom nodded. "Been a while. Heard you shot a hole through a collector cruiser with a civilian freighter. Tell me that's not true." "Wish I could," Rick said. "But yeah, that happened." The last to arrive was someone Rick had only met once before, a small alien named Pip who barely came up to his knee. Pip's species didn't have a name humans could pronounce, so everyone just called them Pip. They were experts in exotic matter, the weird stuff that barely existed in normal space. Pip had 6 legs, crystalline eyes, and a translator that made them sound like a chain-smoking grandmother. "This better be worth it, Hayes," Pip chittered through their translator. "I was in the middle of a very delicate experiment involving antimatter and cheese." "Why cheese?" Beth asked. "Why not cheese?" Rick led them out to the Iron Mule's hull. When they saw Vorath, the reactions were immediate and varied. Beth's jaw dropped. Tom pulled his sidearm before Rick pushed it back down. Pip made a noise like wind chimes being thrown downstairs. "That's a dragon," Beth whispered. "An actual, honest-to-God dragon." "Indeed I am," Vorath's voice filled their minds, and everyone jumped. "And I am pleased to meet beings who might actually solve my predicament rather than simply gawk." Tom holstered his weapon slowly. "Okay. So dragons are real, they're telepathic, and one is chained to your ship. What else haven't you told me, Rick?" "The chains are alive, they're set to explode if we remove them wrong, and the collectors are probably on their way here with a fleet." Rick ticked off the points on his fingers. "Oh, and Vorath here is apparently one of 7 beings holding reality together, and the bad guys want to capture all of them to control dimensional travel." There was a long silence. Pip broke it first. "Well, that's significantly worse than antimatter cheese. I'm in." Beth was already pulling out scanning equipment, her eyes gleaming with the kind of manic excitement that made Rick nervous. "The energy signature is incredible. These chains are operating on principles that shouldn't be possible. They're feeding on dimensional energy and converting it to, oh no." "What?" Rick asked. "They're not just chains. They're parasites. Bioengineered organisms fused with technology. They're alive, Rick. Actually, genuinely alive, and they're eating Vorath from the inside out." Tom circled the dragon, examining the chains from every angle. "So we can't cut them. Can't blast them. Can't remove them conventionally without triggering a detonation. We're looking at a dead end." "Not necessarily," Beth said, her fingers flying over her scanner. "Parasites need to recognize their host. They need to know what they're feeding on. What if we could confuse them? Make them think they've already consumed their prey?" Pip scuttled closer, their crystalline eyes reflecting the chain's glow. "You'd need a substitute energy signature. Something similar enough to fool them but different enough not to actually feed them." Beth turned to Rick, and he didn't like the look in her eyes. "Human neural patterns are unique in the galaxy. Our brains operate on frequencies that overlap with dimensional energy in ways no other species does. That's probably why Vorath could teach you dimensional engineering so quickly. Your brain was already halfway there." Rick felt his stomach drop. "You want to use me as bait?" "Not bait. More like a decoy. We link your mind directly to Vorath's while the chains are active. Your neural pattern floods the system, confusing the parasites. They think they've already fed, they power down, and we remove them during that window." "And if it doesn't work?" Tom asked. "Then the chains detonate, we all die, and this section of the station becomes a crater." Beth adjusted her glasses. "But theoretically, it should work." "Theoretically," Rick repeated. "That's a real comforting word, Beth." Vorath's voice rumbled through their minds. "The risk is substantial. Your mind was not designed to merge with mine. The feedback could kill you, leave you catatonic, or simply burn out your consciousness entirely. I would not ask this of you. Rick looked at the dragon, at the chains slowly killing it, at his team of misfits and outcasts. He thought about the other anchors imprisoned somewhere, about reality itself hanging in the balance. He thought about his sister and her kids, about all the humans scattered across the galaxy just trying to live their lives. When you put it that way, Rick said, kind of sounds like I don't have a choice. Tom put a hand on his shoulder. There's always a choice, brother. Yeah, and mine is to not let a dragon die chained to my ship. That's just bad karma. Rick turned to Beth. What do you need? The next 3 hours were a blur of preparation. Beth and Pip built a neural interface using parts scavenged from the station's black market. Tom rigged up a dead man's switch, just in case Rick's heart stopped. They'd sever the connection automatically and try to remove the chains manually, consequences be damned. Rick sat in the chair they'd welded to the Iron Mule's hull, electrodes stuck to his head, wires running into equipment that hummed and sparked in ways that definitely weren't safe. His mouth was dry. His hands were shaking. For the record, he said, if I die, someone needs to feed my cat. You don't have a cat, Tom reminded him. Then get me one and name it after me. Posthumous cat ownership. Beth checked the readings one last time. Neural interface is stable. Vorith, are you ready? I am. Rick Hayes, your courage honors my kind. If you survive this, I will ensure your name is remembered. If I survive this, I'm taking a very long vacation. Rick gripped the armrests. All right. Let's do something stupid. Beth activated the interface. The universe exploded into Rick's mind. He felt himself stretched across dimensions, his consciousness expanding beyond anything human minds were meant to experience. He saw the birth of stars, the death of galaxies, civilizations rising and falling in the blink of an eye. He felt Vorith's memories, thousands of years of existence, the weight of being a guardian of reality itself. And he felt the chains. They weren't just feeding on Vorith's energy. They were drinking knowledge, stealing memories, converting the dragon's very essence into data streams that flowed back to the collectors. Rick's human stubbornness kicked in. These chains thought they could just take whatever they wanted? Not on his watch. He pushed back, flooding the connection with every random thought in his head. Old Earth rock songs, memories of his uncle's garage, the taste of cheap whiskey, the smell of engine grease. Human chaos, messy and unpredictable and completely unlike anything the chains had ever encountered. The parasites recoiled, confused. This wasn't dimensional energy. This wasn't what they were designed to consume. The feedback loop stuttered, hesitated. Now! Beth shouted, and Tom and Pip moved in with tools that glowed with exotic energy. Rick felt his consciousness starting to burn. The connection was too much, too vast. His human brain was never meant to hold this much information. He could feel himself starting to slip away, dissolving into the cosmic awareness. Then Vorith did something unexpected. The dragon began severing connections, cutting the link early, sacrificing the complete dissolution of the chains to save Rick's life. The universe snapped back to normal size. Rick gasped, his body convulsing in the chair. Alarms were screaming. Beth and Tom were shouting. Pip was making sounds like a broken music box. And then, with a sound like breaking glass, the chains shattered. Rick's vision went black, but not before he saw Vorith spread wings that had been bound for so long, scales glowing with colors that hurt to see. They'd done it. They'd freed a dragon. Rick's last thought before unconsciousness took him was that he really did need that vacation. Rick woke up 3 days later in a medical bay that smelled like disinfectant and burnt circuits. His head felt like someone had used it as a drum, and every muscle in his body ached like he'd been hit by a truck. Twice. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Easy there, hero, Tom's voice came from his left. The big engineer was sitting in a chair that looked too small for him, arms crossed. You've been out for 72 hours. Beth said your brain activity looked like a light show. Honestly wasn't sure you'd wake up. Rick groaned and managed to prop himself up on his elbows. Did it work? Is Vorith okay? See for yourself. Tom pointed out the medical bay's viewport. Through the reinforced glass, Rick could see the dragon floating in space near the station, no longer cramped beneath his ship. Vorith's wings were fully extended, easily 100 meters across, and they caught the light from the nearby star in ways that made Rick's eyes water. The dragon was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The chains? Rick asked. Shattered into about 1 million pieces. Pip collected some fragments for study. Beth's been going nuts analyzing them. Tom leaned forward. But we've got a problem, Rick. A big one. As if on cue, the medical bay door slid open and Beth rushed in, her hair even more disheveled than usual. "Is awake? Good. Rick, you need to see something. The neural link, when it was active, you absorbed some of Voritha's knowledge. Your brain activity is showing patterns we've never seen in humans before." Rick touched his temple, and it was true. He could feel something different in his head, like a new sense he'd never had before. When he looked at the walls, he could see faint lines of energy flowing through them. The station's power grid, the dimensional stresses from nearby ships jumping to hyperspace, even the quantum fluctuations in the atoms around him. It was all there, visible in ways that shouldn't be possible. "What happened to me?" Rick whispered. "You're seeing dimensional currents," Beth explained, helping him sit up properly. "Voritha's knowledge merged with your neural structure. You're not fully human anymore, at least not in your perception. You can see things the rest of us can't." Before Rick could process that, alarms started blaring throughout the station. Red emergency lights flashed in the medical bay. Tom was already on his feet, checking his communicator. "They're here," he said grimly. 12 collector warships just dropped out of hyperspace. They're surrounding the station. Rick forced himself out of bed, ignoring his protesting muscles. He made his way to the viewport, and his new vision showed him something terrifying. The collector ships weren't just surrounding them. They were creating some kind of energy net, a web of force that pulsed with dark power. They were boxing them in. Voritha's voice filled his mind, and Rick realized with a start that the connection hadn't been severed completely. A thin thread still linked them, allowing communication across the void. "They have brought everything, Rick Hayes. They mean to recapture me or destroy us all in the attempt." The station's communication system crackled to life. The same cold, mechanical voice from before echoed through every speaker. "Surrender the dimensional entity Voritha immediately. Failure to comply will result in the complete destruction of New Prometheus Station and all inhabitants. You have 1 hour." The station went into immediate chaos. Rick could hear people shouting, ships trying to undock only to find the energy net blocked their escape. They were trapped. 10,000 people, maybe more, all about to die because he decided to free a dragon. Tom was checking his weapons. Beth was frantically calculating something on her tablet. Rick just stood there, his new vision showing him the terrible power the collectors had brought. There was no way to fight this. No clever trick or last-minute save. This was it. Then Vorith moved. The dragon's massive form glided through space toward the closest collector warship. Rick felt the ancient being's anger through their link, rage that had been building during every moment of captivity. But there was something else too. Determination. Purpose. "Vorith, what are you doing?" Rick asked through their mental connection. "What I should have done from the beginning. They want to recapture me? Let them try." The dragon opened its mouth, and reality itself seemed to bend. A beam of pure dimensional energy, similar to what Rick had accidentally created but 1,000 times more powerful, struck the lead collector ship. But this wasn't just a weapon. Rick could see with his new vision what was really happening. Vorith was creating a dimensional fracture, a crack in the fabric of space itself. The collector ship didn't explode. It simply ceased to exist in this reality, phasing out of normal space and into somewhere else. Somewhere Rick's human mind couldn't quite comprehend but his enhanced vision could see. The ship was falling through dimensions, scattered across multiple realities at once. The other collector ships immediately opened fire. Energy beams, missiles, exotic weapons that warped space itself, all converged on Vorith. The dragon's scales flared with light as the attack struck, and Rick felt pain echo through their connection. But Vorith didn't retreat. Instead, the dragon spoke. Not just to Rick, but to everyone. The voice boomed across every communication channel, filled every mind on the station and in the collector fleet. "I am Vorith, guardian of the dimensional boundaries, one of the 7 anchors that hold reality together. You have imprisoned my kin. You have sought to enslave forces beyond your understanding. And now you threaten innocents who showed me kindness." Another dimensional fracture opened, swallowing a second collector ship. "If you attack," Vorith continued, "I will collapse the dimensional barriers in this entire sector. Your ships will be scattered across infinite realities. Your crews will spend eternity falling between worlds. And you will never, ever, find your way home." Rick's enhanced vision could see it wasn't a bluff. Vorith was already preparing the collapse, dimensional energy building around the dragon like a storm. If released, it would be catastrophic. Not just for the collectors, but for everything in this region of space. The dimensional barriers were what kept reality stable. Without them, chaos would reign. The collective fleet stopped firing. For a long moment, nothing happened. Rick held his breath. Tom's hand was on his weapon. Beth was gripping her tablet so hard her knuckles were white. Then, one by one, the collector ships began to power down their weapons. The energy net started to dissolve. The mechanical voice came through again, but this time there was something different in it. Not quite fear, but definitely respect. Acknowledged, dimensional anchor Vorith. The collective withdraws. But this matter is not concluded. The Council of Collectors will not forget this day. The ships began to retreat, their engines flaring as they prepared to jump. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving only empty space and a station full of stunned people. Rick sagged against the viewport, his legs suddenly feeling like jelly. Tom caught him before he could fall. "They're gone," the engineer said, disbelief in his voice. "They actually left." Vorith drifted back toward the station, and Rick could feel exhaustion radiating from the dragon. Creating those dimensional fractures had cost enormous energy. The ancient being was free, yes, but still recovering from months of captivity. "Is it really over?" Rick asked through their link. "No," Vorith replied. "This is only the beginning. There are 4 more anchors imprisoned. Without them, without all 7 of us maintaining the boundaries, reality itself will begin to fracture. The collectors know this. Other powers know this. They will use us, or they will let the universe tear itself apart." Beth was already connecting pieces, her scientific mind racing. "That's why they wanted to capture all of you. With control of the anchors, they could monopolize dimensional travel. They'd control all faster-than-light commerce, all exploration. They'd own the galaxy." Rick looked out at the stars, at the vast universe he could now see in ways no other human could. His simple life as a cargo runner was over. He'd touched something cosmic, something that mattered in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Then we need to free the others," Rick said. "Before someone worse than the collectors gets the same idea." Tom checked his weapons again. "That's a suicide mission. You know that, right?" "Yeah," Rick admitted. "But someone's got to do it. Might as well be us." Vorith's approval washed through their mental link. For the first time since being chained, the dragon felt something like hope. Word spread through human space like wildfire. Within a week, every colony, every station, every ship captain from here to Earth knew the story. Some guy named Rick Hayes, a nobody mechanic from the Outer Rim, had freed a dragon and faced down a collector fleet. The details got wilder with each retelling. Some versions had Rick piloting a battleship. Others said he'd punched a collector admiral in the face. Rick found the whole thing embarrassing. But the one thing everyone agreed on was this: humanity had just moved up in the galaxy's pecking order, whether they were ready or not. Rick sat in a cramped office on New Prometheus Station, still not fully recovered from his ordeal. His new vision came and went in waves, sometimes showing him the dimensional currents flowing through everything, sometimes just giving him a splitting headache. Beth said it would stabilize eventually. Tom said he should start wearing sunglasses and calling himself Captain Cosmic. Rick told Tom where he could shove that suggestion. The door opened without warning, and 3 people walked in wearing suits that screamed military intelligence. The woman in front had sharp eyes and the kind of posture that said she could kill you 6 different ways before you blinked. Her badge identified her as Agent Collins, Human Defense Intelligence. "Mr. Hayes," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "We need to talk about your dragon." "Vorith isn't my dragon," Rick replied. "We're partners." "There's a difference." "Right. Partners." Collins pulled out a tablet and showed him a star map covered in red markers. "These are collector strongholds. Intelligence suggests they're holding at least 2 more of these anchors at heavily fortified locations. The Galactic Council is pretending this isn't happening because officially acknowledging it would mean admitting they are powerless to stop it." Rick studied the map. His enhanced vision kicked in, and he could see the dimensional distortions around certain areas, places where reality was being stressed. "You want us to break them out?" "We want you to save the universe," Collins corrected. "The collectors aren't the only problem. We've intercepted communications from the Vraxian Empire, the Merchants Guild, even some council members. Everyone wants control of the anchors. If they succeed, if they weaponize beings that hold reality together, we're looking at a war that could literally tear the galaxy apart." Tom leaned against the wall. "So what, humanity's supposed to save everyone? We're barely a century into space travel. Most species still think we're dangerous children playing with fusion reactors." "Exactly," Collins said with a thin smile. "No one expects humans to be the heroes. That's our advantage. We're underestimated, undervalued, and honestly, most of the galaxy wishes we'd just stay in our corner and stop causing trouble. But we won't, Beth said quietly. She'd been standing by the window, watching Vorath circle the station. That's not who we are. Someone needs help, humans show up. It's stupid, reckless, and it's gotten us in trouble 100 times. But it's also why Vorath trusted Rick. Rick felt Vorath's presence in his mind, the dragon listening to the conversation through their link. What do you think? He asked silently. I think your species is magnificently insane, Vorath replied. And that might be exactly what the universe needs right now. Collins pulled up more information on her tablet. We're not asking you to do this alone. Since word got out, we've had 1,700 volunteers. Engineers, soldiers, scientists, pilots. They all want to help. Most of them have no idea what they're signing up for, but they want in anyway. Rick laughed, a short bark of disbelief. 1,700 people want to help a mechanic and a dragon break into the most secure facilities in the galaxy to free beings that most folks didn't even know existed last week. 1,800 now, Collins checked her tablet. The number keeps growing. That was humanity in a nutshell. Give them an impossible mission with terrible odds, and they'd line up to volunteer. It was the same spirit that had pushed humans off Earth and into the stars, the same stubborn refusal to accept limitations that drove every engineer, explorer, and dreamer. Rick thought about his sister and her kids, about all the normal people just trying to live their lives. He thought about reality itself, hanging in the balance. Then he thought about Vorath, chained and suffering, and the other anchors still trapped somewhere in the dark. All right, Rick said finally. But we do this my way. No military chain of command, no politics, no bureaucracy. We pick the team, we plan the mission, and if someone's got a better idea in the middle of a fight, we listen. That's how humans work best, controlled chaos. Collins considered this for a long moment. Then she smiled, genuine this time. Deal. The brass won't like it, but honestly, that's part of your charm. You don't play by the rules because you don't know what the rules are. Over the next 2 weeks, New Prometheus Station transformed into a staging ground. The Iron Mule got a complete overhaul, rebuilt with tech that shouldn't exist but somehow worked because humans and one very patient dragon figured it out together. Beth led a team of physicists in understanding dimensional engineering. Tom trained combat groups in tactics for fighting in places where physics got weird. And Rick? Rick became something he never wanted to be, a symbol. People looked at him like he was a hero, some kind of savior. It made him deeply uncomfortable. He was just a mechanic who'd seen someone in trouble and couldn't walk away. That was all. But Vorath understood. Heroes rarely choose their path, the dragon told him during a quiet moment. They simply refuse to take the easier road. That refusal, repeated enough times, changes everything. The breakthrough came when Beth and Pip cracked the dimensional coordinates for the nearest prison facility. It was on a planet called Kragath Prime, deep in collected territory. The facility was built into a mountain, shielded by enough firepower to level a fleet. Security was airtight. Getting in would be nearly impossible. Getting out alive? That was just fantasy. Rick called a meeting with the core team, Tom, Beth, Pip, and a dozen others who'd proven themselves capable. He laid out the plan, such as it was. It involved dimensional jumps that hadn't been tested, improvised weapons built from theory and hope, and a whole lot of luck they probably didn't have. This is suicide, one of the volunteers said flatly. Her name was Casey Grant, a shuttle pilot with more guts than sense. You know that, right? Yeah, Rick admitted. Probably. But here's the thing, if we don't try, reality starts falling apart. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but eventually. The anchors are failing without each other. Vorath can feel it. The dimensional barriers are weakening. So we can sit here and watch the universe slowly tear itself to pieces, or we can do something about it. Tom checked his rifle for the 100th time. When you put it that way, suicide mission sounds almost reasonable. That's the spirit, Rick said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. The Galactic Council found out about their plans, of course. They sent a very official message saying that humanity was overstepping its boundaries, that this was a matter for established powers, that Rick and his team should stand down immediately. Rick's response was short, no thanks. But feel free to help if you want. They didn't. The Council species had spent centuries building careful political structures, intricate alliances, rules and regulations for everything. The idea of a ragtag group of humans just charging in to save the day offended their sense of order. Better to let the professionals handle it, once they'd formed the proper committees and held the necessary meetings. By which time, of course, it would be too late. On the day before departure, Rick stood in the cargo bay of the Iron Mule, now outfitted with technology that made it more warship than freighter. Volunteers were loading supplies, checking weapons, saying goodbyes to loved ones. The ship could hold maybe 50 people comfortably. They were cramming in 80. Vorath landed on the station's outer hull nearby, the Dragon's massive presence visible through the bay's viewport. Through their link, Rick felt the ancient being's gratitude, its hope, and yes, its fear. Even dragons could be afraid. Think we can pull this off? Rick asked silently. I have seen empires rise and fall, Vorath replied. I have watched stars die and new ones ignite. In all my long existence, I have learned one truth. Never underestimate beings who refuse to accept the impossible. And humanity, Rick Hayes, has made an art form of the impossible. Rick smiled. He looked at his crew, this collection of misfits and dreamers who'd volunteered to save beings most of them had never heard of. They were teachers and miners, soldiers and scientists, people from every human world. They had nothing in common except one thing, they gave a damn. All right people, Rick called out, and the cargo bay fell silent. Tomorrow we do something stupid. We break into a fortress, free a prisoner that reality needs, and probably piss off every major power in the galaxy. It's dangerous, it's crazy, and honestly, we'll be lucky if half of us make it back. He paused, meeting their eyes. But that's okay. Because we're human, and doing the right thing even when it's stupid is kind of our whole deal. So let's go show the galaxy what happens when you underestimate a species too stubborn to know when to quit. The cheer that went up shook the cargo bay. Tomorrow they'd face impossible odds. Tonight, they celebrated being magnificently, beautifully, perfectly human. And somewhere in the dark between stars, reality held its breath and waited.